Should you go first?
Yes, this is Bishop Enoch.
And this is Deacon Joseph Swaden, and this is Orthodox Apologetics Live. We do this. We try to do this every week, and sometimes we do it every couple of weeks. But anyway, this is a pre-debate show. It's the first of two formal debates that I'm going to be having on the 19th and on November 2nd. So, as always, we're going to be touching on questions and answering questions, discussing topics, so on and so forth. Basically doing the same thing.
Okay, so what's the debate going to be about?
Well, that's an interesting question. The debate is, I guess, the person I'm debating is a guy named William Albrecht, and he introduced the debate premise as the Immaculate Conception, ancient and biblical. I obviously chose the negative side. So, I'm not exactly sure how he's going to prove it. Because if you have to prove something's ancient, you have to prove it's patristic.
Mm-hmm.
But I don't know of a single church father you can find church fathers that teach, that Mary was immaculate, that Theotokos was immaculate. You can find that they taught she was sinless. But the Immaculate Conception dogma is really specific. And I don't want to give away the debate here, but that's a really specific doctrine. And I don't think there are any church fathers that you can find that will even come to an answer that close. You have to come up with some sort of strategic kind of...
Yeah, simply referring to Our Lady as the most immaculate ever Virgin Mary doesn't really prove anything, because that doesn't necessarily refer to that her conception transpired without original sin. Mm-hmm. For example, I believe in some fathers you have reference to, for example, St. John the Baptist. And the scripture says he was full of the Holy Ghost from his mother's womb. Mm-hmm. And I think there may be some fathers maybe some texts that say, I'm just going to go off here, I think maybe in the 9th century that say St. John the Baptist was born without original sin or something. But that was simply interpreted as the fact that the Holy Ghost filled him when he was in his mother's womb. So it was almost like he was given the grace of baptism almost in the womb, but then not at conception, if you know what I mean. So that still wouldn't even that wouldn't be Immaculate Conception. That'd be like getting baptized hypothetically in the womb at 6 months. But anyway, I didn't mean to throw it off, but I'm saying that a lot of these references, for example, there is one reference, and it's not really a father, but a 9th century writer, I think Rantram Paschasius or Rantram of Corbie, in which they try to use this as a reference to the Immaculate Conception. But if you really look at it, it doesn't have any reference to that. It's just simply, the Virgin was full of the Holy Ghost from her mother's womb. That's quite a different thing ontologically or metaphysically, I don't know how you say it, than being conceived in a state of purity, almost like Adam's soul was at his creation. All right, so that's or in a higher elevated state. That's different. Like you said, not to get too much involved into it.
Now, Assaulter Rifle just asked, DL Verum wants to know how many minds Christ has, 1 or 2, and if the Trinity has 0, 1, or 3 minds. DL says that he doesn't mean nous by mind, but I have no idea what he means then.
I'm not sure what he means. Christ had a human soul, and he had a human mind because of that. So, is he asking a question about the hypostatic union?
I'm guessing that would be
because the persons of the Trinity all have the same will, operation, omnipotence. They co-inhere in each other. They're distinct. But they have the same essence. I'm very cautious about these questions because it seems like I'm not saying he's trying to do this. And I'm not saying Christian or DL is trying to do this, but it seems that sometimes people have to be careful with these answers or these questions because it could lead one to something like modalism, or kind of. I think he had asked previously about Apollinarianism, and how was that not compatible with Orthodoxy. And of course, it's not compatible. So, yeah. Because in Apollinarianism, they didn't believe Christ had a human mind, or even a human. I think maybe they later admitted initially they said he didn't have a human soul. I think later they admitted he had a soul, but it was like a soul without a mind, and everything else was supplied by the divinity of the Logos and such, which meant that essentially it was just the Logos puppeting kind of a bunch of some flesh, and such. So. I don't has I offhand I would say simply the best thing to do is read St. John of Damascus. I don't know if that might, it's kind of a maybe book two. That
Yeah.
might not be the best quick answer, but he had
The
our Lord had a human mind, but his human mind was not in any way. His human mind was part of the soul,
The
obviously.
mind is the mind is an interesting concept because of the fact that of course Orthodox are Theophysite. So the point is he had a divine and human nature. Does the mind belong to the divine nature? Does it belong to the human nature? Does it belong to both? If you're thinking of the mind as a conjoined object, then you would say that the divine and the human mind are the same. In his case, but the point is that you can't subsume one into the other.
Yeah, his soul, which the human mind will be part of the soul. The soul didn't suddenly become, swallowed up in the divinity to the point where it does cease to exist.
Yeah, exactly.
So that's the Monophysite doctrine and such. Now, if he's asking, do each of the persons of the Trinity have their own mind? I mean, they're each individual. They're each distinct hypostasis. That's true. But I'm
It
very
depends on how you
very
define
careful.
mind.
Yeah, and I'm very careful simply because of the word. I'm simply careful because I'm simply careful because, among other things, when we speak about the human mind and try to relate it to God, God is uncreated. It is obviously, and so how do you use the term mind to reference human concepts to something that's uncreated? Father Joseph, can you continue talking? I have to step away for
No, not a problem. Not a problem, Vladika. Okay, so we're gonna go through the comments that have come up since. Assaulter says that DL thinks that each person has to have a mind in order to have existence, but I've never heard of anything like this before. Well, I mean, rocks don't have minds, but in any case, okay. So DL says, "I'm all right. I'm here." Assaulter says Apollinarians think that Christ didn't have a human nous and the Logos replaced the human nous in the incarnation of Christ. Sean says, "Howdy, howdy." And then he said, "Whoa, wait a minute, Assaulter. I propose the persons share one mind." It depends again on how we're taking the term mind. Is the term mind part of the hypostasis? A mind is obviously not a physical brain. That's not. It's we're talking about a spiritual concept. So you can't automatically say that it's not. In some sense, I guess it would be shared between the three persons of the Trinity. And so the point is, a mind or an intellect. Well, yeah, but once we start getting into the intellect, then it slowly we start devolving somewhat into the biological levels. And so,
okay, I'm back.
yeah, and so because
let's put a pin in this, and while we answer other questions, I'm going to look through St. John Damascene real quick to make sure.
Okay, that's fine. So we're gonna mind and intellect are nous in Greek. I agree, and the Trinity has one will. So that to me seems to solve the problem when we're talking about the spiritual aspects of the mind as opposed to the brain, which Christ had a human brain, and obviously the Father and the Spirit do not, because they're not human. But the point is, so that's I would say that's what it sounds like. It sounds like I'm kind of like not being clear here, and the reason why is because when we're using the term mind, we use it often interchangeably with intellect or with the brain, or with.
That's more of a modern way of thinking about. I mean, the concept of the mind and the brain are synonymous.
Well, it is a modern concept, but that's my point. Is that I don't think that the fathers would have envisioned. They would have envisioned, like, can Christ have two brains, for example? I think they would have thought that it was one mind, a divine mind, and a human mind.
There's one subject in the Son of God, in the union, and that subject is the Son of God taking humanity into Himself. Right. So it's not like the Nestorian concept of you have two cooperating of forces in alliance. You know what I mean? The Son of God and the Son of Man, and the union is just some sort of like prosoponic union. And it's just they're agreeing to cooperate with each other, and that's all. That's it, right? So the question is, the Son of God has his divinity, and he is a divine hypostasis, and he has his humanity that he took from the Virgin. So,
right. Okay, that wouldn't mean.
Go ahead.
Well, insofar as, say, for example, well, I'm gonna, the point is that what I'm simply saying is that it wouldn't be, in other words, it's not like an arm. The point is Christ's divine and human will had power over his arm. and I would assume they had power over his mind. So I don't think that they would be, but that doesn't mean they're two minds. It's simply one mind.
Okay.
I could be wrong, but let me think here. So let's see what comments and questions have we gotten on the Orthodox Apologetics War Zone and War Room this week, and let's see if there's anything in Discord. I'll open that up, and we'll see what's going on. Okay, let's see here. Okay, still waiting. Okay, so okay. All right. I don't know if you want to. I mean, let's see here. The first one is.
I did have to remove several posts and some people from the war zone. If people think I did that unjustly, please reapply. But the problem was that people were. This is what happens every 4 or 5 weeks. People began to post more and more questions that really don't relate to Orthodox apologetics. Really relates to, for example, the question about do genuine Orthodox churches allow women to use the service cantors. I mean, that really was not an apologetics question. And then I don't know, but it really seemed that people wanted to use it as like a way to slag on true Orthodoxy. To throw slag or, that's another word for, I think, like molten metal and things like that on the church. And I was thinking about writing a whole comment before I did this stuff about, there's in the life of St. John Maximovich, he was doing, I think, Matins one day, and he just asked this lady who was the only one there to read the Psalms or something like that. All right. And, I can't imagine.
I was wondering what happened to that discussion. Yeah. I mean,
because I was about to post some stuff and saying, what is this really apologetics? I was going to post some other stuff. And I was like, this is really not the place for this. I mean, if you're going to post something like that, you need to relate it to Orthodox apologetics. You need to say something like, do the genuine Orthodox churches allow this? If so, is this in concord with the fathers and the scriptures? And then put an apologetics point in there and all the rest. Because to be frank, true Orthodoxy, we didn't cease commemoration and commune with the patriarchates because some lady was being allowed by some bishop to read the Psalms because that was the only person there on a weekday liturgy or something like that.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? And it's true, the Canon of Trula says a woman should not read in church. That's absolutely true. But the fact is that did you have people allow it even in the 19th century, like St. John even the 20th century, like St. John Maximovich? Yes. But even the Catechism Church, yes. But that's really not an issue that has to do with apologetics.
That's a liturgical question.
And it can be referred. It's like if someone asks me about I can never pronounce it. The Palapathera, which is the old name for the canonical tonsure, the crown tonsure, right? Which was in fact observed in the Greek Church originally until the 11th, 12th century when it began to fall out of practice. That's an interesting discussion. But does it, and I like talking about that on other groups because of history of the canons and such, but does it really have something to do with the question of Orthodox apologetics? No, not really, unless you try to relate it to something. And it can come up in some maybe discussions if somebody tries to bring it up like, oh, the church supposedly abandoned this, etc. But there's a lot of interesting points that don't really relate specifically to apologetics, and they maybe belong in other groups. And there's that, other group that was usually the sister group of this that you could probably bring it up there. But,
well, was it the OTA?
Yeah, maybe someone can do it there. I'm just saying.
I don't think that. I think that. Well, they sometimes they do the same thing we do. Sometimes if it's not really apologetics related, a lot of the time they'll ban it.
Yeah.
So it's not like we're the only ones doing it. But in any case,
all right.
It's just that it's stuff that if it doesn't have to do with defending the faith, it probably shouldn't be there. But
okay, now in St. John Damascene's book 1, and in chapter 8 concerning the Holy Trinity. Okay, so I've been looking through the one. This is the one on orthodox.net because you can easily search through that one. Mm-hmm. Concerning the question of mind, it says, and this may be perceived through the whole of creation, but in the case of the holy and super essential and incomprehensible Trinity, far removed from everything, it is quite the reverse. For there, the community and unity are observed in fact through the co-eternity of the subsistences, that's the hypostasises, and through their having the same essence and energy and will in concord of mind, and then being identical in authority and power and goodness. I do not say similar, but identical, and then movement by one impulse. So, because they have the same operation, essence, will, and concord of mind, this is, and the subsistence is co-inhere, yet they have a distinction. It would seem like they're referring to the Trinity as having one mind in that sense. Certainly concord of mind. That is, there's not discordant wills in the Trinity, or it's not like they each have their own distinct gnomic will or mind, and they just happen, So that's why I can look for some other references in St. John. But now in I found another reference in book 1, chapter 12. St. John Damascene says, God then is called mind and reason and spirit and wisdom and power, as the cause of these, and as immaterial and maker of all in omnipotence. And these names are common to the whole Godhead, whether affirmative or negative, and they are also used of each of the subsistences of the Holy Trinity in the same way, very way, and identical way with their full significance. When I think of one of the subsistences, I recognize it to be perfect God and perfect essence. But when I combine and reckon the three together, I know one perfect God. For the Godhead is not compound, but in three perfect subsistences, one perfect, indivisible, and compound God. And when I think of the relation of the three subsistences to each other, I perceive that the Father is a superessential Son, source of goodness, fathomless sea of essence, reason, wisdom, power, light, divinity, the generating and productive source of good hidden in it. He himself then is mind, the depth of reason, beginner of the Word, and through the Word, the producer of the revealing Holy Spirit, of the revealing Spirit. And you can find some other references too. So, on
this topic, I noticed DL just brought up a distinction of mind with it would be a distinction of essence within the Godhead. But St. John just said there's a concord of mind there, so I don't know that it would be a distinction. I'm assuming that Father Enoch is reading from the exact exposition, but it could be
yes. So book 1. It's in the book 1 of
the exact exposition of the Orthodox Faith by St. John of Damascus. Assaulter Rifle asks, is the new council set up between World Orthodox and Oriental Orthodox going to go further in ecumenistic heresy by making further agreements with the Monophysites, or do you think things will stay on the same way of ecumenism? That was probably in response to what showed up on the Warzone. I put that up. It was actually yesterday. They suddenly resurrected the joint commission between the World Orthodoxy and the Monophysites. That was literally yesterday. So, I mean, it's too early to tell, but the fact that they're reviving it tells me that they have some reason that they're reviving it.
Well, to relate it to an apologetic sense, the reason we talk about this is that Chalcedon is non-negotiable in both not just the ideas in some abstract sense, but the actual council, the acts, and the exposition, and the canons, and the anathemas. So you can't get around those.
And
if you do, you're basically producing another Akakian type, Henoticon heresy.
Yeah, what people seem to forget, and as you bring
this was tried before under Akakius, and it caused basically the whole Orthodox West to cease communion with the East over this,
including the Pope. So
and now there were various churches in the West and the East. I'm sorry that never accepted any of this, but this was always the way for Monophysitism to get its foot in the door, was by saying, well, can't you just, make Chalcedon optional or something like that? But I think the reason, and this gets into the apologetic and the polemic against Monophysitism in the defense of orthodoxy and apologetic wise, but the reason politically probably why this is being resurrected is that there's probably some geopolitical reason because of Russian troops in Syria, and the fact that the Moscow Patriarchate basically wants to have, for example, they just have this big procession in Moscow between Moscow Patriarchate priests and Indian Uniate Malabar clergy, of all people, which I guess aren't Monophysite technically, going into these churches, and they have all kinds of stuff like that going on. I mean, you just check with the Moscow Patriarchate webpage, is like a third or half of it's always.
Maybe there's a larger program we're not aware of. If we're seeing this,
because remember, Antioch does have a communion agreement, limited. But it is a communion agreement with the Monophysites. Now, this isn't I don't know how well people know this. I mean, I've encountered Antiochians who just sincere people that just they don't know anything about it,
Well, that's because in the U.S. it was never implemented. Metropolitan Philip refused to allow it.
Yeah, well, which is interesting. That's interesting? He would refuse to allow it. I mean, if assuming that actually he didn't allow Monophysites to take communion.
Right, he said we're not allowed to do that in America. But I
don't know about that. I've actually heard people say, they have.
Oh no, I'm not talking about individual cases of communion. Yeah. I'm simply talking about the actual agreements, which talk about the mixed marriages and stuff. Like he basically was like, "Well, we're not doing that here," and so it made no sense.
So my point is that in Syria they have this agreement where the Syro-Jacobites can go to Antiochian churches and vice versa without them being. In fact, they're forbidden according to the agreement to receive people from one church into the other. So if you're a Syro-Jacobite and suddenly you're like, "Oh well, Chalcedon is true," and you go to the Antiochian priest, he technically he can't say, you're going to transfer to her.
You
can't. Yep. So it puts, and obviously I think them going to the Antiochians wouldn't be going to the church anyway. But it's the same thing with Alexandria. Alexandria has a similar agreement with Copts, the Coptic Monophysites. And so this is in fact interesting when I talk to, or when I'm sure you and others talk to Syro-Jacobites or Coptic or other anti-Chalcedonian / Monophysites, they don't understand the whole resistance because their view is that this union has essentially already been accomplished in Antioch and Alexandria, and now this is just the working out of things and letting everybody know about it. So to them, it's very odd that anybody should oppose any of this.
I'm actually very much in favor of referring to it as anti-Chalcedonian as opposed to non-Chalcedonian. Non-Chalcedonian makes it sound like it's an accident in history, like, oh, we just never knew about Chalcedon.
I said anti-Chalcedonian.
Oh, I know. That's why I brought that up. Now, yes, and Sean pointed out they do it all the time in the U.S., in the Antiochians, Greeks, Ethiopians. No, I understand that. There's OCA parishes which take in a bunch. I've seen it, like the one in Chicago, which has I think it even has like a Coptic style iconostas, if I remember correctly. But the point is, what I was saying was the actual agreement between Antioch and the Monophysite had to do with things like what Father Enoch mentioned about not being able to receive each other's people. It had to do with mixed marriages, which priest would preside, which priest stands in second place. It's usually based on age. When they share churches, how to do it. Like, it's not as simple as simply communing one side from the other, which is bad. But it's actually an organizational kind of flow chart for how you're supposed to commune with people from this other group.
Yes, sorry.
No, it's much more complex. Now the question becomes, what now that they're reviving this joint commission? Is it possible that they finally decided it's time to move to the next level and start doing something like they do in the Middle East? Mm-hmm. If it is, well, that's not good, but that's their choice. So not much you can do about that. But I'm kind of glad that Salter brought that up because that was on the War Zone. So that's something that is worth discussing. Somebody in Discord asked if there are any true Orthodox churches in New Hampshire, Maine, or Massachusetts. I'm from the New England area, just wondering. Someone said there's one near Portland, Maine. There are also TOC churches in the Boston area. Let me think.
Don't go to Hockna. Make sure they're not Hockna.
Yeah, just make sure they're not Hockna. Go to the Hockna churches. There's Matthewite churches there. I mean, even that's better than going to, heretics. So, there are some. There are some in the New England area. We don't have a directory anymore, and I have no idea whether we're going to produce another one again.
Maybe I would say if somebody's interested in this subject, they can go to. Well, we don't have the director. I'm sorry, you're right. We don't. Okay.
Yeah, but we do have a bishop on the line. So if you guys wanted to talk about missions or things like that, if starting that's not a problem. So that's handy, having you there. Let me see here. Okay, so that answers that question. And we go to the War Zone. There's the question, of course, that I have to kind of what's it called? It's about a favorite topic. It says it's Hans Mosley, and he writes, how would you respond to someone who criticizes the Orthodox Church in particular and Christianity writ large to be anti-Semitic based on quotes from the early church fathers in the Bible itself? How do you explain the very real subversion coming from the quote-unquote Jewish community, aka Synagogue of Satan, while assuring the church welcomes all who wish to sincerely embrace Christ in the Orthodox teachings?
I answered this already in the comments.
Oh, you did? Okay.
Yes. Well, I'd like to point out that the church is always welcoming to anybody who wants to truly convert, which means to actual convert. The problem is that you have legislation in the ecumenical councils that actually does refer to the Jews. because a lot of times Jews would join the church and they wouldn't sincerely convert. They would do it for, I don't know, they wanted to be able to own Christian slaves or something like that. The converso problem. I mean, that actually is not. That's not just a Spanish issue. In the
that wasn't
14th
just a
century.
problem with the Spanish.
Yeah,
That's
actually that goes back into Byzantium too. And what I say, I'm going frank. I mean, what is true is that as a whole and distinct, as a distinct people, the Jew. Now, not meaning there aren't individual groups and there weren't individual Jews who are always going to be repentant, but Jews as a whole, as an identifying group, have not been friendly to the church. That does not result from Saint Constantine persecuting them. That goes back before that. That's to the time of the Pharisees. They did not like orthodoxy. They despised Christ.
It's really very simple if we break it down, and that is that the Jews believed that they were the people of God, and Christ kind of opened the door for the people to be everyone else.
Yeah, and I should point out that even after many Jews simply gave up belief in God, atheism and such came into Jewish life as a normative thing beginning in the 19th century. Even though they gave up kind of their old religious views, they still kept the attitudes of dislike toward Christianity continuously. I mean, for example, one could look at Lazar Kaganovich, who was basically the guy behind the Ukrainian Holodomor. He despised Orthodox Christians, and he despised also Slavs, strangely. But anyway, and he was Jewish. I mean,
but a part of that is there's this, because are Jewish Slavs, and a lot of Slavs say no.
Yeah, I mean, pretending a lot of Jews will say a lot of these types of Jews would have thought them. I mean, it's very strange if you get into some of this stuff where some Jews consider the Germans to be like their equals, but they think the Slavs are lesser than them. It's a very odd. Anyway, not to get too much involved in that, but the church has dealt with Jews and has always seeks to convert them. But for example, there was the famous converts, the apostles, for example. But you read St. John's Gospel. Like the other Gospels, and when he talks about the Jews did this, the Jews did that, it seems very strange to many moderns who don't really understand it, because St. John, of course, came from a Levitical family, actually.
Yeah.
But why would he refer to the Jews as a whole, even if he himself was Jewish? It's because he's understanding it as a whole. It's, for example, like a Russian writer is referring to the Russians as a whole. Like, let's say during Russians when they were pagans, and he may be the only Orthodox Christian in the area. He's not trying to say he hates his mother or something like that. Of course not. But that's just simply how it's been. You can read St. Hippolytus from the late 2nd, early 3rd century, who does talk about there were some groups that were ethnically Jewish that were friendly to the church. What happened? They basically disappeared. They were generally called the Essenes, the foreign Essenes. And St. Hippolytus talks a lot about them. And they simply just abandoned whatever religion they had and became Orthodox over time. All right. And so you see the triumph of Phariseeism, or the so-called basically Talmudism, in their life, and that dominated their whole culture and their way of thinking and everything from basically the 3rd century onward. And I mean, you have the famous Saint Joseph of Tiberias, who was one of the assistants to one of the Jewish patriarchs. See, the Jews used to have like a patriarch. There was a patriarch in the west and a patriarch in the east. They had like a patriarch who lived in Palestine, and he was like head of this Sanhedrin. And if you read St. Epiphanius of Salamis, he speaks about this. St. Epiphanius himself, by the way, was from a Jewish family in Palestine originally, as I believe. And when he was either 16 or 18 after his parents died, he was free to be baptized. Now, he was basically ostracized from the community after that, but he didn't really care. He just left, and he went to an island, a Greek island or something. And St. Epiphanius is oftentimes accused of being like one of these most anti-Semitic of the fathers. But St. Epiphanius himself knew the Jewish population in Palestine because he was one. He came from that. And so he understood the attitudes and the way they behaved. And he talks about how St. Joseph of Tiberias, who was one of the assistants to one of these last of the Jewish patriarchs, that this last of the Jewish patriarchs was actually baptized on his deathbed, because this is going to sound strange, but according to the accounts, they knew that Christ was in fact the true Messiah, but that they were not willing, due to pride, to ever really admit it. This is in fact what St. Epiphanius says. It's what St. Joseph of Tiberias says. And this almost sounds conspiratorial, like the upper echelons knew this. But then again, remember, as strange as that may sound, remember when our Lord raised Lazarus from the grave. And then that message and it says many of the Jews converted when they saw that right away. They're like, oh, this is really the Son of God. This is not some demonic trick raising somebody from the dead whose body was stinking, And when it says in the gospel that when the Sanhedrin discovered that, they said, oh, great, now we got to kill this guy. It wasn't that he raised a corrupt, decaying corpse from the dead that proves he is the divine Son of God. It was, we got to kill him. All right. So simply just saying, well, if people had seen this or seen that, they would have. A lot of these are spiritual problems that are affecting people, demonic deceptions.
Yeah.
And that's
worth noting that many, I hate to say this, but many Talmudic students who even studying the Old Testament still come to Christ today because of it. It's just for many, it's just there's no way around that.
Yes.
And then
they will. Yes, you're right. Studying, especially if they study the Old Testament, they will uncover things that point to our Lord. Now, they may not become Orthodox, unfortunately. But
there's so much heresy.
They're trying to wade.
We have to work harder.
They're trying to wade through all this stuff. Now, there may be Jews who, in fact, may realize that Jesus Christ is the Son of God, but they're like, well, forgive me for using the word "like" so much, but they may simply understand that to say anything like this, to become any kind of quote-unquote Christian, is to lose their whole family, and they just don't do it.
Yeah, they do a few.
And our Lord talks about that in the Gospels, how he who does not love mother or father or brother or sister more than me cannot be my disciple. And there were Pharisees who did believe our Lord was who he said he was, but they didn't want to lose their position because they knew they would be put out of the synagogue. So that's kind of been the position. It's one in which the Jewish leadership has basically inculcated this attitude into the population, and it wasn't really, in my opinion, until we get to the early medieval period that there was kind of this détente that was basically the 500s and 600s. You see kind of a détente form between Christian society and Jewish society. And that was, and basically the détente was the concept that people kind of talk about in these studies, which is that the Jews have their own communities. Legally, they're going to be protected as long as they don't try to cause any problems among the Christians. They can have their autonomy. They can do this, they can do that, and they can do all the other things. All right. And they need to be left alone.
That didn't work out too well in Spain.
Well, it didn't work out too well in Spain. And in Antioch, it caused all kinds of problems because the Jewish population was just simply so large. They murdered St. Anastasius, the patriarch in the 590s. And he was, in fact, preaching and trying to convert Jews. And they did not like it. And they basically attacked him in the streets. And they held him down. And when he wouldn't renounce Christ and convert to Judaism, they basically opened up his bowels, took out his intestines, and basically strangled him all as they were laughing at him and such. And then, the Roman army came there and it was going to put down the rebellion. And then they kind of, as often happens in the Roman government, they did, especially in the Byzantine period, if they could avoid massacring a large population simply for economic reasons or reasons of political stability in the region, they would. And that, instead of holding trials for the people who did this, there was like a general amnesty. And then that later resulted 15 or 16 years later in the Persian invasion, the Jewish population cooperating and turning over basically Syria and Palestine over to them, which followed a massive massacre at the wells of Mamre in Jerusalem, where 60,000 Orthodox refused to convert to Judaism. And so the Jews basically killed 60,000 Orthodox, and they threw them down into the well.
I'm going to step out for just a second, Father.
Okay, so, that's the history of it. It wasn't pretty. I mean, people point to negative legislation by the Spanish synods, the Toledan synods in the 600s, that prohibit Jews from owning slaves. And some of them actually say that Jewish children should be removed from custody of their parents and given to Orthodox parents. And that sounds very bad, but I think the attitude of the Spanish clergy was simply that you're dealing with kind of a weird cult religion that charges interest from people. It tries to buy Christian slaves. Many people were especially abhorred with the perverse manners in which many of these Jews were doing their circumcisions with their teeth. It was pretty disgusting. And so the Spanish clergy in the 600s and the civil authorities thought, well, this is basically almost like a child molester organization that is in all kinds of weird stuff. And so they felt it was right to take the children away. I don't know how well those customs, those canons were enforced. but they dealt with some pretty terrible leadership. That doesn't mean, we didn't want to convert the Jews, but you're dealing with something that's almost like a cross between ISIS with I don't know, but kind of business savvy, I guess. I don't know how to explain it. And there were various attempts, and eventually the Jewish population so disliked the fact that they were prohibited from engaging in the slave trade in Hispania that they cooperated and collaborated with the Islamic invaders to take over Spain. And Seventh Ecumenical Council, as I mentioned, has legislation, I think, seventh canon, that says that Jews should convert, but they have to really convert. They can't go back to using the Hanukkah candles and the kosher and all this other stuff. Now, in fact, a few years ago, I had a gentleman approach me who was formerly a Hasidic Jew, and he wanted to convert to Orthodox. Well, he wanted to join our jurisdiction, and he had been previously part of 2 or 3 other ones. And he was giving the excuse that he had to leave the other ones because they were anti-Semitic. And I wasn't too sure about that. And when I questioned him and learned other things, the problem was this gentleman wanted to still retain kosher laws. He wanted to still do his own synagogue service. He wanted to still do his Talmudic studies. And he wanted to somehow combine this with Orthodox Christianity, which cannot be combined. You can't mix light and darkness, oil and water in this case, or light and darkness. And I said, look, this is just simply not something we can accept. I mean, he apparently had worked for the Israeli intelligence or some kind of organization. I was like, oh, this is not a good thing, at that point. And I said, look, if you want to be baptized or chrismated, and you want to give up this stuff, and you all right. And my plan was eventually just to set him down and put a pork steak in front of him, since he was only a layman, and say, eat this. And if he would eat it, then I'd know he would be serious about, converting. But if he wanted to keep the kosher laws, then that's not something we allow. And it's just that simple. Now, this guy later left and he joined the Ecumenical Patriarchate Church, and then he said a whole bunch of bad stuff about us, that we're like rabid, evil people, and we won't accept the Jews and all this other stuff. But then he has his own, Jewish outreach organization where he's teaching people the Talmud is really good and compatible with the church fathers and all this other stuff. So, I mean, that's an example that the Seventh Council is actually talking about. People who claim they want to convert but actually don't want to convert. They want to do their own thing, and retain basically something the church said is not acceptable anymore.
Well, I can understand that happening when somebody wants to gain social advantages, like we saw in the early centuries. But I can't understand why someone would do it now.
I think it had more. I don't really know. I don't really want to go much more into the case. I mean, he harassed somebody else that was associated with us that happened to have been Jewish. And it was a whole weird. I mean, and then they were getting us involved into these arguments between. It was like these different Jews arguing with each other, and it was. I don't want to go more into it. It was just. It was insane. Okay. But my point is that's something you have to deal with. That people have to convert, and they don't, and they actually have to convert. So.
No, it's true of every nation, including the Jews. You have to, you're going to have to challenge everyone around you.
Okay.
Now, did we touch the next question that popped up from Assaulter Rifle on the?
No, I'm not looking at anything. So.
Okay. Okay. Well, Assaulter Rifle wrote, "Have you all seen the new Origenist comments by David Bentley Hart? So he isn't classified as a Marcionite? He says that Origenism is the only solution to not have an evil God in the Old Testament, aka Marcionism."
What is the Origenist? What is the Origenist? I'm sorry. Go ahead. Sorry.
Oh. And some people from AFR, Ancient Faith Radio, are supporting David Bentley Hart. We'll get to your next question, which has to do with the Amazon Synod later, because this is all one question. I haven't seen what Origenist comments he's made, but I have heard of him making a lot of Origenist comments. But this thing, that Origenism is the only solution to not have an evil God in the Old Testament, or aka Marcionism, who, Marcion rejected the Old Testament altogether. So David Bentley Hart is a heretic. I don't know. He's a very famous heretic, and because he was a philosophy writer or something, he's a very published heretic, but he's still a heretic nonetheless. And I doubt that he'd ever care what our opinion is on these issues. But the simple reality is that all that stuff he's saying is it's utterly and completely trash. There's nothing you can, there's no way to defend it. So I don't understand what more to say on that. It doesn't surprise me that Ancient Faith Radio is supporting it, because they support lots of things that are awful. And they recently had to put out a statement because they had to explain that they're not leftists or something like that, if I remember correctly. It's not unexpected. It's just par for the course. Assault Rifle did further comment, by his point of originism, he means all the supposed bad situations in the Old Testament are entirely fictional and not in any way historical. It sounds like you're about to say something, Father.
Did Origen actually say, not to defend Origen, but did he actually say that? Or is this his interpretation of Origen? And I hate to defend Origen, but Origen sometimes speaks in kind of roundabout or even very hard to interpret under ways. I'm not sure if Origen actually said that, but the explanation is I don't see a need for it. It's coming from a modern way of thinking, or way of thinking that believes the question of the will of God. What they're referring to generally, I believe, are the accounts, the true accounts in the Pentateuch, where God tells the Israelites to go to a city and tell the population to leave, and if they do not leave, they will be killed. All right. I am not sure what the moral difference is between God commanding the Israelite army to do this, and if God simply just caused all of them to die suddenly. All right. God brings, commands millions of souls every day to judgment.
Okay, well, he's saying here, he says, so the killing of the Canaanites and other OT instances are fictional, mythological, and not history. DBH is going even further than Origen. Origen did allow for them to be, I assume, there to be history. In other words, I guess DBH wants to call it in the spirit of Origen, but these are all basically Hart's own words.
Yeah, because it seems Origen would have said something like, "Oh, this happened," but there's also an allegorical meaning to it, etc., etc.
That's a very common.
Yeah, and a lot of fathers would say that, because the fathers would have an historical, allegorical, spiritual, typological, many different layers of interpretation without denying the historical fact that it actually transpired.
Whereas David Bentley Hart is basically just being a typical modernist.
Yeah, I don't really see this is a. I don't see the problem with it. God is the Lord of life and death. His will is ultimately inscrutable to human minds, and we know as much as He wants us to know, and we can perceive. And what He commands, we do.
Well, okay, now Assaulter says, just Origen didn't spend too much time on the historical level, and he commented on the speculative level leading to his heresies. Mm-hmm. Well, again, I think that I hate to say this, but comparing David Bentley Hart in that case to Origen is unfair to Origen. And Origen's a thrice condemned, heretic. But so, I mean, I don't know what camp that puts David Bentley Hart in, but, I guess, having a heresy level like Arius isn't enough to be famous anymore. So, I just...
Well, remember, this is part of the attack that transpired beginning with the Enlightenment and proceeded into the 19th century on the historicity of the Bible. Yeah. Specifically the historicity of the Old Testament. And a lot of people in the 19th century began to accept a certain level of deconstruction of the historicity of the Old Testament, because they thought, well, we can preserve the historicity of the New Testament, and that justifies the resurrection of the Son of God and all the other main events in the gospel. But if you destroy the Old Testament, the New Testament will collapse as well, because our Lord references Moses. He references all these things. And the only way they can avoid this is by saying our Lord just said this in ignorance, which means they have to abandon the traditional Orthodox understanding of our Lord's mind being enlightened by His divinity, where He was not in ignorance. And they have to essentially adopt kind of an Nestorian view, but they're already going that pathway. They will accept anything. So this is why I think when I encounter people who say that it doesn't really matter whether Moses existed or not, or whether this happened in the Old Testament, it does matter.
No, it absolutely does.
In fact, if these didn't, I'll point out a post I had on another group where I pointed out that what was his name, Professor Andreev of Jordanville, who was an old Earth creationist. I don't agree with that, But despite that, he still believed Genesis was accurate. He just had a different interpretation about it. He would still try to. My point is that even though he was wrong about his order of creationism, he still took Genesis historically seriously. He may have, tried, and he still believed Adam existed and all the other things happened.
Well, yeah, it's worthy of note that whether you're old or young Earth creationist, the human timeline does not deviate significantly, because humans, according to even for lack of a better word, evolutionists don't say it's more than 10,000 years. That
exactly. So do you see the point that even people like that, I'm not saying in the negative sense, they still took the scriptures historically seriously as true.
Right.
In the case of these individuals, they just simply throw it overboard. They don't care. And if you try to defend the historicity of the Old Testament, you'll simply be accused of being a fundamentalist. Because they refer to in their mind. Sorry to cut you off, Father Joseph.
No problem.
In their mind, fundamentalism is anybody who believes, I don't know, what's written about Abraham actually happened, and people who believe Moses actually existed and did everything written in the book of Exodus and the rest of the Pentateuch. But if you go back before 1890 or 1880, 99% of any organization, of all the people calling themselves Christians, whether they were Orthodox or they were heretics, if you're going to either
the same thing,
they would have said, yes, of course this happened. Yes, of course. But once the modernism development happens in the 19th century, it begins to challenge it. I think there's this Father Tikhon on the group pointed out on a few occasions that in Russia, anytime somebody even slightly influenced by kind of this English or German modernism, to maybe like question a little bit of the historicity of parts of the Old Testament, the imperial censor and the ecclesiastical censor would have simply said, no, you can't publish that. All right. And it wasn't because the Russian Orthodox bishops in the governing synod were like, I don't know, fundamentalist Louisiana Baptists. It was because they simply believed the Bible, what the Bible preached and said is actually what actually happened. And people who challenge the Bible, this is eventually the way they're going to go. And they're going to start to, once they can do away with all these issues regarding what they claim are immorality, supposedly, which are not committed by the Israelites, they're eventually going to call upon dismantling, guess what? The moral system, such as the prohibitions against sodomy and homosexuality.
That's exactly where it all leads to, and that's exactly what I was going to get to. I do want to put up Assault Rifle's comments where he says, Origen's been surpassed by DBH on his own heresy because Origen at least allowed for some history. All the church fathers are fundamentalists, then, so the modernist accusation against us is really against the fathers. No, you're absolutely right, and this dismantling that you're talking about, Vladika, is exactly that's the goal all along. It's not just to prove that Adam's not real. It's not just to prove that Moses is not real. It's to prove that Christ didn't really say what he said. It's to prove that St. Paul didn't really mean what he said. Ultimately, this modernistic sort of deconstruction is nothing more than weaseling their way into trying to undermine the moral teaching that has always been held by the church. It's really that simple. And that's why, I have, there are people who disagree with me, and there are people who are not exactly fans of what I have to say. And so I understand, people having detractors. I could point to somebody like Jay Dyer, for example. He has his detractors. But the point is, people like David Bentley Hart, who actually go out of their way to create heresies and then cultivate a fan base from it, I think they're really dangerous people. I would not that I'm saying dangerous in the physical sense. I mean, nobody who looks at David Bentley Hart would consider him a physical threat. But what I'm referring to is a spiritual threat, because these people they're experts in sounding like they're telling the truth, when in reality, what they're really good at is just lying and making up stuff, and basically getting people to lose faith in the fathers and instead follow fallible men who, frankly, aren't great thinkers to begin with.
For we have not followed cunningly devised fables when we made known unto you the power and coming of our Lord Jesus Christ, but were eyewitnesses of his majesty. That's Amen. What St. Peter said in 2 Peter 1:16. They weren't making things up. So if it's possible, what I don't understand is this. If one believes, as supposedly maybe this Mr. Hart does, that our Lord Jesus Christ, if he believes he is in fact the truly God incarnate,
which is a greater leap of faith to understand that God Himself became man, or that God would order the Israelites to destroy a city. Once you accept the incarnation, the supposedly most improbable things to happen, all these other occurrences in the scriptures, they're child's play to believe they happen. But I don't think what's happening, though, maybe I'm wrong. Maybe it's not that he is saying it couldn't. He's saying it's immoral for it to have happened. And this concept is that his morality knows better than the will of God, I guess. So.
I think that what it comes down to is, and I mean, to that end, that level of kind of modernism is really Marcionist to begin with. But Marcion had a kind of a different motivation. And what I mean by that is that I tend to think that these modern writers, when they're doing this, they're really trying to undermine Christ himself. I mean, Christ himself referred to Moses and the prophets. He's God. So that means if their hypothesis can even be considered correct, that A, Christ is a liar and therefore God lies, or B, that what's it called?
He didn't know. Yeah, he was ignorant, which leads to Nestorianism.
And that's exactly the problem, is that ultimately, if you accept the reality of Christ, you must accept the reality of the Old Testament. It's just that simple. And it's funny because I'm shocked that it's gotten as far as it has in World Orthodoxy, because it doesn't get that far in Protestantism. It just dies. I mean, I hate to say it.
Forgive me for interrupting you, but remember, in Protestantism, there was what was called the modernist fundamentalist split in the 19th century, in the early 20th century, in which basically you had those Protestants who didn't care or willing to make peace with it becoming the modernist mainline groups, and those who were like, no, we want to hold the older traditional view, basically becoming what are called the evangelical or fundamentalist churches. And but even when they've done studies of people who profess to be evangelical Protestants, many of them themselves are willing to accept the Bible has all kinds of false histories in it.
That's because they've been taught that, yeah.
Exactly, and they're supposed to be members of the supposed evangelical churches, or so-called evangelical churches. And remember, within papism, so-called Roman Catholicism, technically much of this was not even allowed until the late 1940s, when there was like Divino Flentu Spiritatu or something like that.
Yeah, Divino Appellante Spiritu.
Yeah, where he supposedly, I don't know if Pius XII actually believed it or not, or he just whatever, but he issued an encyclical or decree or something saying that you could make use of the tools of modern biblical archaeology and studies.
Right, that's what led to the debacle of the New American Bible and all their translations.
Exactly, and now, I don't, and then again, of course, he may have actually secretly believed that stuff. They had not been the real traditions, because he was always saying stuff like Jungmann. He believed whatever Jungmann said, et cetera, et cetera. But I mean, that all came in Roman Catholicism basically in the 40s and 50s, and that led to people questioning whether the Gospel of Matthew was written first, then the Pentateuch went. I mean, I know people who grew up in the 40s and 50s that went to Roman Catholic schools, and they were like still having old textbooks that were saying that Moses wrote the Pentateuch, and technically, you have to believe the scriptures, et cetera, et cetera. But then that all kind of falls apart in the late 50s and 60s, and you can just believe whatever you want to believe about anything. And that has its fallout coming into Orthodoxy.
Yeah.
You see, once they have the ability, now the Soviets in the Soviet Union, I can see that they wouldn't want to promote that. There was the famous professor of the Old Testament at the Leningrad Theological Seminary back in the 60s or something, who began to bring some of this in, and then he basically openly came out as an atheist. It was like a big propaganda cue for the Soviets and such. But the Moscow Patriarch just let it happen because it was all planned to begin with, just to make the Moscow Patriarch look like it was, just like this impotent, corrupt organization. And the Soviets had no problem doing that because they controlled it. But in the other parts, you see this coming into Greece. I knew some people who went to the Thessalonica Theological Seminary back in the 70s and 80s, and they were kind of bringing this stuff in.
Yeah.
And I think, interestingly, as I understand, there was a Greek New Calendar professor either there in Athens, who was like kind of this old conservative, and Paniotis Trimbolos, I believe, or something like that. Mm-hmm. He died in the 60s. And I think he was against a lot of this stuff, but he was just really old, and followed John Romanides, hated him, and they got rid of him. And John Romanides believed in the whole biblical criticism stuff too.
Yeah.
Even though they claim he doesn't, if you look at the things he translated himself, he's pretty evident. He believes in this, the Babylonian mythology being put into the Old Testament and such. So, they did a number on things. Once they take over the seminary system in the mainline so-called patriarchates, then you can control the new generation of clergy. And even in Jordanville, they didn't allow a lot of the stuff, but there were minor tinges of it, even in the 70s and 80s. All right. Yeah. And it kind of got bigger and bigger. And I think probably HTM had something to do with it for their own reason. Brocor just for some reason never thought to get rid of these little tinges and fringes of textbooks that were being introduced. And it just exploded later on. And then, after all, if you want to be assimilated to the other World Orthodox clergy, you don't want to be saying things that are going to make you look obscurantist or reactionary in their minds. So, and that's thankfully, as far as I understand, most of this has been kept out of true orthodoxy. In fact, if I find it anywhere, I'm going to immediately stamp down on it, and so other people. I mean, just not going to tolerate it. But then again, that's just the root of modernism. It tries to infiltrate and take over everything. And this David Bentley Hart simply just an example of that.
Yeah, it's pretty sad. Assault Rifle did write this, and in World Orthodoxy, they harp on the fact that Eastern theology is mystical, so they use it as an excuse to teach already condemned heresies. I hate to say it, but the whole Eastern mystical canard really doesn't hold up to much scrutiny. There is a place for apophaticism, and it is actually a useful didactic tool. But you can only carry it so far. Eventually you just have to say, okay, that's either just ignorance or willful deception. So I don't think that it's fair to I say that because the people who do that usually are doing it with an agenda, and it's usually, I've found, a personal agenda, and that agenda is usually, I have no idea what you're talking about, so I can't give you an answer.
And then when you try to engage in any kind of conversation with them, they simply use words like they kind of deconstruct everything you say, and ultimately they're not saying. Yeah. Okay.
And then let's see. There's more comments on Romanides. Yes, we agree. He is definitely probably one of the most respected modernists of the 20th century, and thankfully, hopefully, he stays there. And so. In any case...
now, Romanides, by the way, was a big proponent of the ecumenism with the Monophysites.
Yeah, he was.
In fact, to bring that around to the first discussion, he did not like Saint. In fact, he refused to refer to Saint Leo the Great as Saint Leo. It was very strange when he writes these papers about this. He referred to very strange among some of these modernists. If they refer to a saint that they don't like, they just refer to him as Pope Leo or Leo.
Yeah,
or John or Augustine or even John Chrysostom.
Pretty much.
If suddenly they begin to like something he says, then it becomes saint. In the case of Romanides, there was an NFT article I wrote about this some time ago, in which he basically defends Dioscorus as being great, and he just simply attacks Saint Leo as basically being a little more than a crypto Nestorian. And by the way, many of St. Leo's theological writings were consulted with St. Prosper of Aquitaine, since we're discussing that, by the way.
Yeah.
According to Gennadius. So that also, and St. Photius the Great speaks very in positive terms about many of the writings, or at least some of the essential writings of St. Prosper of Aquitaine. If you look in St. Photius' Bibliotheca, it's published as the Library of Photius on Google Books. So, okay.
Let's see here. Now I have an interesting thing, because I'm looking at my one of the things that I was going to discuss, since we're talking, it is again the pre-debate show, is the second debate that I'm doing is on clerical celibacy in the West and whether it was enforced. Now, I know that you're kind of a big source of knowledge on this, Father, but one thing where I'm having a problem is, of course, there's I'm looking at it from the perspective of, okay, there were canons in the West that pushed for the continence of the married clergy. The question I'm looking for is, what evidence do we have that they weren't taken as seriously, besides, say, for example, the letter of Ulrich of Imola. But I was wondering if you know.
First off, we need to bring this point up. what canons are they referring to? When were they written? Who wrote them? What are the earliest manuscripts? I'm sorry to go down this route.
Yeah.
What were the how what's the original Latin? What ways are there to interpret them? Because if you're positing a situation in which they're promoting priests and deacons not sleeping with their wives, yet no one obeyed it, that might tell you that maybe how we're translating or understanding the canon is not the way people understood it at the time.
So just to clarify, because I know you've looked at a lot of this stuff before, right? So there are like problems. So I should actually probably review these canons themselves, because I may find that there are issues in them.
Yes.
Okay, I'll do that.
I think that's an important point to do. Another point is to make sure you're not dealing with any pseudo-Isidorian decretals or something like that.
Right.
Because that's simply not. And another point is to make sure that you're not dealing with an issue where they're telling clergy they shouldn't marry. That if it's an issue where a bishop says something or a council says priests should no longer take wives, well, of course, priests should not be married.
Yeah, they shouldn't be taking a wife after they're.
Or they're going to a cathedral or to a church, a collegiate church, and they're saying that the canons of this church should not be having wives. Well, technically, that's accurate, because canons were kind of like a monastic order, where they followed the rule of Saint Chrodegang or Saint Augustine, and they were taking vows of celibacy, chastity, obedience, poverty of some sort, etc. So simply pulling up cases in which they're trying to expelling canons from cathedrals, canons of Saint Augustine, and saying, they were getting, because they expelled the canons because they had women, that doesn't really prove anything, because it'd be like if you went to a church and the monks there had wives, and then the bishop said, well, look, I'm sorry, I'm expelling all of you. You shouldn't have wives. You're monks. Again, you'd have to be very careful. Another point, if they point to like rescripts, perhaps papal rescripts, maybe I'm going off memory here, like Pope Saint Siricius in response to the Bishop of Tarragona. A papal rescript they were asking the opinion of a pope about a subject. All right, it wasn't interpreted by the church wide as having kind of like this authoritative canonical enforcement upon everybody. Right. Another point is that if you look at the letter, I think Pope Saint Siricius, which is sometimes brought up, which is translated on some of these sites about clerical celibacy, that he's saying that how can the deacons and priests enjoy the marriage bed when they have to offer the sacred oblation every single day?
That's another point to be made, because a lot of these are in reference to not doing. It's part of the fast before you celebrate.
In fact, many of the traditional commentaries will say it's not just Saturday before; it's Friday. Friday also, you can't do anything on Friday. You can't neither on Wednesday. So the point is, if you were a part of a group of deacons and priests in a cathedral or church, and you're being expected to offer and participate in the sacred oblation, the Mass, the liturgy every single day, and to take communion, because they didn't make a separation. If you were a deacon serving in your vestments at the liturgy, you had to take communion, and if you didn't give a good explanation two Sundays in a row, you technically were excommunicated. So if you're expected every single day to serve Mass, and you're a married man, that's going to obviously create a situation. So if you know what I'm trying to say, that's not so much.
I absolutely understand it, because you're supposed to fast for marital relations before you celebrate and before you commune even.
And remember, even lay people, every Wednesday and Friday, theoretically, it was extended to Saturday even, because the day before. And this is where you get to the idea of the 3-day fast, by they meaning abstinence. I'm not getting involved in that. But that actually, whether I know there are some Calivades fathers who didn't believe in that for food wise or meat wise, and whatever. They did believe in fasting from meat and dairy on Fridays, but they thought you could actually eat meat and dairy on Saturdays as well. And anyway, that's a whole other discussion. But you do find mention of this 3-day fast in the medieval period prior to the schism, because people took it very seriously. So if lay people took it that seriously, then clergy who had wives had to take it even more seriously. Yeah. And the problem is that if you're a priest, and then you have to celebrate Mass on every Sunday as major feast, and there are a lot of 12 lesson or 9 lesson feasts that got into these calendars. I mean, you look at, sometimes you'd be celebrating Mass maybe, and combined with Lent and the Advent fast and the post-Pentecostal fast and the Michaelmas fast and every Wednesday and Friday. There would be only specific days in which one could, possibly procreate children. All right. So I mean, but this is even true for modern Orthodox clergy.
Yeah.
Right. Now that may not, whatever happens, they may have to go to confession or whatever, if that even happens. I don't know. But I don't see a lot coming from these issues about the rescript of Pope Siricius to the Council of Tarragona. How are the canons interpreted? Simply pointing to Pope so and so saying this, and then no one following it.
Yeah,
may mean either that no one obeyed the Pope in Rome, or that they understood him in a way that we in our
currently don't.
Hildebrandian post-schism way of beating back into things. For example, there are references in some ancient decretals about in the West, or ancient canons, that they reference that you need the permission of the Apostolic See to consecrate a bishop. And they put these into the Pseudo-Isidorian Decretos. And they were using the word Apostolic See to refer to what? Old Rome. The problem was that if you look in the actual, many of these canons and texts, Apostolic See, just giving as an example of misinterpretation, Apostolic See was often referring, guess what? To metropolitan sees, by the way. In fact, if you look in the installation of the bishop service in the Pontifical of Egbert, of York, St. Egbert of York, and many other pontificals, when even a regular bishop, a ruling bishop, not an auxiliary bishop, when a ruling bishop is installed, he is said to be Bishop of Apostolic See. St. Bede calls the Archbishop of Canterbury Archbishop or Bishop of the Apostolic See. Okay, so that's an example of how they later took a reference, they narrowed it down, if you know what I mean. So it only refers to Old Rome, and then they can, what's it called, post facto or after the fact, or read back anachronistically hundreds of years later in the 12th century, read back into something saying, well, it says the Apostolic See has to give permission for a bishop to be consecrated. Therefore, that means Rome.
So basically, the technique here is just it's the basic apologetic method we always use, which is refer back to the original text, check the context, and so I was just wondering if there was like some sort of solid tradition for celibacy in the West, and it doesn't sound like
there may be somewhere. I mean, for example, I was thinking of the case of St. Chrodegang of Metz, but even in St. Chrodegang's case, he is dealing with canons, people who were saying they are canons.
Well, like canons being kind of semi-monastic.
Canons were clergy who were not. Well, it's very strange. St. Augustine says he lives in a monastery. So there was this whole debate in the medieval period whether canons were actually monastics, should be simply considered monastics. Anyway, but if you're dealing with people who are saying that they're canons of a church, then either they took vows or they didn't. And if they didn't take vows, they're not really canons. And at that point, they don't really necessarily get beneficent, the money supplied from the church for all their, not getting to that. But yes, look through the sources.
Okay, that's not a problem. It'll take me a little while, and then I'm not worried about it. I thought there were. I'm always
now. I can tell you now. I'm not saying there weren't people saying these things. I don't want to go that far. Maybe I'm stepping back too much. I know that Saint Epiphanius of Salamis, supposedly they point to him saying in some of his writings that the clergy should not sleep with their wives because they should be offering the sacred oblation every single day. Now, if that's your reason,
if you're doing that, then if you're doing the oblation every single day, you're in a consistent Eucharistic fast all the time.
So exactly. So if that's your rationale for clerical celibacy, or so-called, or chastity, marriage is chaste anyway. You can say chastity.
Yeah.
But if that's your rationale, it's not clerical celibacy in the way we understand it, or the moderns try to impose it.
Right. The modern understanding. Right. Okay. Yes. No. Okay. Well, then I'm not terribly worried. I'm always wondering when I'm going to get the gotcha, where somebody's going to, and of course, I'm human. It's a psychological thing, where you're wondering, okay, well, where could I be wrong on this? And but I guess my concerns were largely unfounded because I know you've done a lot of studies on this, Father.
Well, again, I would say look at the original source, watch the context, watch the provenance of the manuscript, who were they writing to, watch the conditions around it. I think those are all important.
Okay, that's easy enough for me to do. Then I'm not worried about my second grade either.
Yeah. Otherwise, it's a statement taken out of context, and it doesn't. And if they start bringing up secondary commentators on it, well, then that's an argument with the commentator about the meaning.
I'll shut that down before it even starts.
So, I mean, it might be best to have him individuals. What I prefer, maybe this is not what people do in debates, but what I was told to do was that
everybody should ahead of time send their arguments to each other. Now this isn't done, and there are sources, so everybody can examine it. And at least in Speech and Debate Club and forensically, we were taught.
I've never seen that.
We were taught you did that for the purpose of coming to the truth. So everybody knows things without trying to surprise somebody. But it may not be, maybe not. People aren't looking for the truth. I don't know.
Well, that's a good point. I mean, and this is something that, I was discussing with the person in the first debate that I'm having, because, he was asking me questions about my actual, positions, for example, on whether the Mother of God was immaculate. I felt like uncomfortable. And now I've never been part of a formal speech and debate club. I've done debates, but I had no idea that you were supposed to reveal your information ahead of time.
Well, I'm speaking of like policy debate. You would write something, send it to them. They would write something, send it to you, and you go back and forth, and then you'd have a public debate.
I feel like if I did that with every debate, I'd never have one.
Well, it's all right. I mean, you don't have to do that. I'm just.
I just feel bad because I know what I'm dealing with when I'm dealing with Roman Catholicism. Maybe that's why I need to explore outside the box and debate with more Protestants. But I mean, I kind of know these things, and so I feel.
Well, we'll see what happens. People may like the more spontaneous discovery of facts on the ground and such.
Well, yeah, but then I don't want it to feel like a gotcha moment either. I mean, this is just kind of a.
Well, if somebody's whole point is simply gotcha, then they're not really interested in coming to the truth. They're interested in winning points and making it appear to listeners that they had some kind of great, there's some kind of great.
Yeah, well, it makes me wonder whether I should, lay out, the simple reality. But I mean, that may end up getting the debate canceled. And I don't want that either.
Okay, well, just see what happens, and you can always have a second debate.
Honesty is the best policy. All right, well, yeah, let's do it. That's the way we're going to do it.
Okay. Any additional questions?
I don't see any new questions on the here. Did you see any on the War Room that you wanted to touch on, Avalika?
We answered the one about the Jews, the one about St. Prosper. Yes, St. Prosper is included in Gallican calendars and some of the early Roman calendars. I wouldn't expect St. Prosper to be found on calendars in Constantinople. Now, technically, St. Ambrose of Milan, who a lot of kind of the more Romanian Hackna type people like to embrace a lot, people forget he wasn't included on Byzantine calendars into the 10th century. And that was because there was one patriarch from Constantinople who was in fact originally from Calabria. And he was like, oh, I like St. Ambrose, let's include him on the calendar, So simply looking on Eastern calendars and saying we don't find St. So-and-so doesn't really mean a lot because they may have not known a lot about him. And they may have, like St. Photius knew about St. Prosper, and his bibliothèque, he calls him truly a man of God. But that didn't make St. Photius say, well, I want to put him on the calendar, even though he's a saint. For example, I'm sure there are all kinds of Russian saints I don't have on my calendar. But that doesn't mean I'm saying they're not saints, if you know what I mean. So I think in that case, for example, St. Patrick, I don't think St. Patrick of Ireland, who's universally accepted by most people who claim to be in the East, I don't think he was put on any Orthodox calendars into the 17th and 18th century.
Yeah.
And so the claim that St. Nicodemus was doing something novel or strange when he put St. Augustine, let's say, on the calendar in the Greek church, he was simply following the previous pattern of people like St. Dimitri of Rostov and others who were like, well, there's this,
we discovered a saint that's not on our calendar.
Yeah, there was a Western saint before the schism, 500 years, 600 years. They read the life of St. Patrick, like, oh, this guy is great, let's put him on the calendar, or at least some minor mention somewhere.
Yeah.
And that's generally how things.
But that didn't mean that they became a saint.
They were already a saint.
Yeah.
And even formal canonization or glorification in the West, that's not something that really happened. At least until you get to the
It was like 1004 is the first.
Yeah, you get to the late 10th century when the popes began to claim that. For example, Saint Ulrich of Augsburg, I think. There was one pope in like 990 who did some sort of official glorification for him or something.
Well, yeah, but even then, that would still be the local glorification. It's not, the idea that only a pope can canonize a saint is something that's well past the schism.
Yeah, oftentimes they'd have a local bishop who died, and he died in an odor of holiness. They would excavate his body, would be incorrupt, or maybe it would be skeletal, but there would be miracles associated with it. People had a devotion. For example, there was the famous saint whose name I cannot remember at the moment. I'm embarrassed I can't. who Saint Ethelwold dealt with. He was a previous bishop of Winchester, whose name I cannot remember. And Saint Ethelwold had discovered a lot of things about him, and he was like, well, we should be venerating him as a saint. And people had miracles associated with it, and they kind of excavated his body, and there was a great aroma of smell coming from it, a wonderful smell, and they processed with his body back to the cathedral. And he was like, oh, now he's officially on the calendar, not just mentioned in some like martyrology or something. You know what I mean? Okay.
All right. Well, if there are no other questions in the chat, I don't see any there. Let me check the Discord. I don't see any there. Nothing new popped up on the Warzone. So I think for this week, should we call it a week? We've gone 45 minutes.
Yeah. Well, maybe we should. Nothing discussed anymore. No need to talk anymore. Okay. Yeah.
No, unless there's something if there's something of interest to discuss, we're here, so let's do it.
Okay. I don't really have anything to say. I would recommend reading through the exact exposition of St. John Damascene again.
Oh, yeah. Definitely.
In reference to the mind of God. Other than that, St. Egwin of Worcester. The translation, that was what I was thinking of. The relics of St. Egwin were translated by St. Ethelwold. No.
Sean just asked, where can we find a list of GOC saints to say saints that the World Orthodox don't recognize? And then Assaulter says yes. That's outside. The problem is that some of the saints, like for example, what was the name of that the nun who was glorified first by the old calendarists and then was glorified by the new calendarists with a totally different rationale?
They claim she left They claim she was just a simple woman, so they couldn't blame her for being part of the old calendarists.
Right, and so the problem is that a lot of the times what ends up happening, like even if you remember, like when St. John Maximovich was glorified, I remember going into a Carpatho Russian church once and seeing a little black and white cutout, and I was shocked because there was a whole debate among World Orthodox about whether they should even recognize it. And this old woman came up to me and she said, "Well, the people will, so it will happen." And the simple reality is St. John Maximovich is now basically recognized everywhere. There's like no doubt. So it's a tough question.
Can you repeat the question again?
Well, the question is, where can we find a list of GOC saints, that is to say saints that the World Orthodox don't recognize? And it's tricky because a lot of the time they end up backdooring them in anyway.
Well, some of them they won't backdoor in, I can tell you.
Oh, yeah, like St. Joseph of Petrograd. But
yeah, I mean, for example, they won't, for some reason, they simply, even though he died with St. Kirill Kazan, and they're willing to put St. Kirill Kazan on the calendar because I guess they viewed him as some kind of ambiguous situation. They simply will not include St. Joseph of Petrograd on the calendar. The Moscow Patriarchate won't, even though he was killed by the Bolsheviks in 1937.
But the simple reality is,
they won't include although strangely, St. Glyceri is found on some Roquefort MP calendars. At least, I'm not sure, maybe not now, but Father Andrew Phillip includes them. That's as strange as that is.
Yeah, but one thing I should note, having lived in Russia for a couple of years, is that St. Joseph of Petrograd is widely venerated among the Russian people, even in the MP, even if he's not actually recognized by the MP hierarchy. So that's a tricky one itself. I mean, there was that famous picture, and this was in the age of smaller cell phones where we didn't have easy picture sharing, where they took the icon of St. Joseph standing over
Sergius.
Yeah, Sergius with the Soviet uniform underneath him. Like, that was considered like a folk icon. I actually saw that icon for real, like the actual original painted one when it was being passed around. But in the age of flip phones, that picture was being sent around thousands of times.
I think off of hand, not to interrupt you too much, Father.
Yeah.
Because someone actually criticized me for interrupting you too much, so I'm going to try to.
Well, whoever that was is wrong. So
I'm going to try to restrain myself.
I condemn them.
I'm avoiding drinking too much coffee and such before I do these programs now, so I won't jump up and become ADHD.
Well, to be quite frank, Vladika, you have a lot of interesting information to say, and sometimes
okay.
I just babble.
Well, anyway, yeah, I babble too. So, anyway, a list of saints, I think you can name some people. For example, generally Saint Chrysostomos of Florina.
Yeah, he was very recently glorified. You won't find him on any list.
Exactly. Again, except for some idiosyncratic people in Rocor today, Rocor MP, Saint Glyceri of Romania.
Mm-hmm.
For example, there's also, interestingly, Saint Jerome of Egina, who some of these new calendarists, again, they kind of still kind of like to refer to him almost as if it's very strange how they deal with him.
I think. Well,
Saint Catherine, the New Martyr.
This is actually very helpful, and I'll tell you why, Father. Because the four people that you've mentioned so far were foundational in preserving true orthodoxy in an age of apostasy.
Yes.
So perhaps that's how you find the saints that we glorify that they don't. Is very simply, who are our leaders that have been glorified?
There was I can't remember his name. There was a Saint John who was a priest in Jerusalem, Palestine, and went back and forth between Greece and Palestine. And in fact, I have mentioned him on one of the groups.
John the Romanian?
No. Well, actually, he was accepted, I think, even by Rocor people because he died in the 50s and he was on the old calendar.
Yeah, he's accepted by the new calendar too.
This was this one. It was a Greek priest, and okay, so here, yeah. Saint John, the new almsgiver of Amphiali, he was the personal confessor of Saint Chrysostomos, Metropolitan Saint Chrysostomos. It says that in his life, they talk about how he approached Saint Jerome of Egina to ask Saint Jerome to hear his confession, and Saint Jerome told Saint John the almsgiver, hieromonk, I believe he was, said, please, Father, go away. You can't hear. Please just go away. And Father St. John walked away, and a nun asked St. Jerome, said, Father, why did you send Father John away? And St. Jerome replied, says, that man, he's blinding. All I can see is light coming from him. He says, how can I, a sinner, hear such a man's confession? And they, in fact, talk about this. There's like an interview you can find, you can listen with Metropolitan, the head of the GOCK in America. I can't remember his name. Metropolitan.
Demetrius?
Yes. He talks about some of this actually in one of those YouTube videos he has. So you have right there. You have Saint John the Almsgiver, the personal confessor of Saint Chrysostomos of Florina, talking to Saint Jerome of Egina. All right. So that's three people there. I mean, in Russia, in the case of Russia, is actually much easier because the hosts of the new martyrs who were against Sergius and the Catacomb Saints
were already glorified.
Yeah, I mean, you're talking about. I mean, you can read Russia's Catacomb Saints that was composed by Father Seraphim Rose, but also Professor Ivan and Professor Andrea doing a lot of the writing actually for them. And there were other sources, but you can read that. And you can right there find probably 30 or more, or 50, maybe 100 or so mentions of real true Orthodox Russian saints right there in that book. I mean, you have St. Peter. I don't know if they were mentioned St. Peter, Schema Bishop St. Peter Ledigan, who died in 1957. He was almost blind, and they kind of allowed him. They didn't put him in a gulag or anything by the end of his life because he's like an old man. I think he was almost 100.
Yeah,
he was basically blind, and he couldn't really do a lot, and so they kind of left him alone. They were hoping he would join the Moscow Patriarchate, but he just never would. But he couldn't really ordain anybody, so they didn't see him as a threat anymore.
Yeah.
Well, they still did kind of in modern, but so you can find.
Yeah, so I mean, but once we're getting to this point, we're talking about the 30s to the 50s. When we get to, the points of the 60s and 70s, and we're talking about
the Romanian True Orthodox in Sladiora, they actually have, I believe, numerous people they have glorified and they recognize as saints. Because
really?
they had intense persecution in the 20s and 30s. For example, Saint Glyceri was like hiding out in the middle of the woods in Romania in the mountains, the Transylvanian or Carpathian.
Do you know if there's any books of collections of that, even if they're not in English?
There's some Romanian people I know. I'd have to ask. It's just it's very difficult to get information. They used to have a website, but then no one maintained it.
Well, it's just because of the fact that I mean. The truth is, when it comes to Russians and Greeks, a lot of these names are already known. But like in the Romanians, I wasn't aware that there was a host of new martyrs.
They had people killed. I mean, maybe I shouldn't say host.
No, they were killed, but I just didn't know their names or any of their lives or anything. So that's interesting.
Well, there is a. I'll just send it to you. There is like a kind of a post that talks. Vladimir Moss actually wrote kind of an interesting article that has a lot of information we can gather about it. Where he talks about various St. Glyceri saying there were various saints he met in the 1930s who were hiding in the caves. And he says no point. He says just they were saints. Anyway, but Russia, the new martyrs would be true Orthodox saints. They were true new martyrs.
And so, I mean, after a martyrdom of that magnitude that we've already experienced, it's a given that
in America
we usually not that common.
In the United States, in true Orthodox, we basically have people we would recognize, like St. John Maximovich, Metropolitan St. Philaret. I don't know if there's really anyone else. I mean, some people have tried to some groups have canonized Archbishop of Urki, I know. There have been people doing that.
That was our talk, right?
Yeah, there may have been, or one of the Rossi groups or whatever. So there are various people who have devotions to them. I know there are people who had just devotions to Archbishop Konstantin Osinski. I mean, when they opened his body up, they found it basically incorrupt. Though they didn't, they had to be very careful how they deal with Archbishop Konstantin Osinski, because Archbishop Constantine was very, very anti-Sergianist and very. Bishop Vladika Konstantin Osinski, in one of his writings, said that the worst thing the Soviets ever did was the creation of the Moscow Patriarchate. Because he says if they had just not opened any churches up, they had just persecuted everybody, nobody would have been able to fool
Nobody would have been deceived.
So this was the worst thing they actually did. So, okay, well, maybe we can leave it there unless we have any more questions.
I don't see any more questions. There's a comment, a book called Resist Unto Blood. It's an English Romanian Old Calendarist book. I will have to definitely get that. Resisting Unto Blood. Father marked in place as Axios to Bishop Enoch. I agree, Axios. And I don't see. There's no more questions. And then Assault Rifle also commented that that's because St. Carey was canonized by Rokor before 2007. Well, then technically St. Joseph of Petrograd is in there too because they canonized him too.
Well, St. Glacieri he was actually glorified by the Romanians.
Yeah, they just recognized it.
Yeah,
but St. Joseph was recognized by the Rokor.
Well, interestingly, when they did the glorification for St. Glacieri back in 1997 or 98, maybe it was 96, the late 90s, you know who the Rokor representative in the glorifications was? It was then Bishop Hilarion Caprol.
Wow.
Who is this? You know who he is now.
Yeah.
So that tells you that suddenly they have this great cognitive dissonance where they, on the one hand, they have to, I don't know, never mind. But no.
It's not our problem.
We have no dissonance about it. They're the ones who have to justify it.
Yeah. They have
and they are changing. By the way, they're having their new generation of people who don't really care, who don't really have to worry about. They'll just say, "Oh, Hilarion, he's just in between the two worlds and all those."
Well, yeah, and it's depressing because it's like whatever generation of Rokor is developing now, it's one that seems to be completely ambivalent, or even worse, completely complacent to the existence of the Moscow Patriarchate, and that's depressing.
And remember how. Every now and again you hear people say, well, that was when Rokor was in schism. Such.
Yeah, I see that, and I'm like, wow, you really don't get this. They couldn't be in schism from the Moscow Patriarchate. It was created in 1943.
That's true.
So it's just ridiculous. But anyway, if there are no other questions and we have no, comments.
But it does put, not to go belabor the point, but it does put to rest the view that the so-called old calendarists, quote unquote, don't have any saints.
No, we have plenty of saints. We have all the saints. We have the best saints. Well, okay, sorry. I had a trump there. I'm sorry. But the point is, we have all the saints. And so...
All right, Father Joseph, I hope your week goes all right and everything goes all right.
All right, and we'll be back, God willing, next week. Unless, we know... One thing we should talk about is the fact that Bishop Enoch has been doing this, as a kindness, I guess, to me, because the truth of the matter is, I think I'm a pretty boring person by myself, but more importantly, he's going to get busier, and this is a reality all of us kind of have to face. And so, I mean, I'm hoping that whatever show we have you on, Vladika, we're going to treasure it, because we don't know how long it is before you're too busy for us YouTubers.
Well, the simple solution is just to study the scriptures of the fathers and all the rest. I mean, it's not me. I'm just relating things I've read from them. It's just I have my memory used to be good. Now it's getting bad as I get older and all the rest. So
it's still pretty good, Vladika.
If I was younger, I wouldn't think so. But anyway,
No,
I'm not that old. I'm 35.
Yeah, you're still pretty young.
I'm acting like I'm an 85-year-old man. So
yeah, the arthritis is setting in now.
Exactly. Yeah. It's all transpiring. Okay. Well, I hope everything went all right. And,
and God willing, we'll be back next week.
And if people have any, I would like to make a kind of request. If people have a reason for the down vote, maybe they could send us a message about why they weren't pleased with the show. You think that's acceptable, Father Joseph?
Yeah, sure. I love complaints.
If it's a legitimate reason, then just simply make a post. It can't just simply be I didn't like how their voice sounded or something like that. That's not a legitimate reason. Okay.
I mean, no, I agree. I think criticism's good. And the simple reality is...
I was recently reading... Oh, sorry. Yeah, here, I'm interrupting again. Sorry.
No, go ahead.
I was recently reading the Russian internet, which is always very interesting and very enlightening. And there's a lot of things happening on it in the Russian religious Orthodox world, obviously. And some stuff we're having to deal with personally. But you find a lot of interesting info on it. And one of the interesting things I was reading about, and this may seem very obtuse to people listening, was the I guess I had to learn this from the Russian internet through translations and dictionary and using Wiktionary to figure out words if they weren't translated right. That it's apparently widely known the history of rope war from the 30s to the 90s in Russia. That is, there's the view that there were two competing factors in the rope war. Okay. And by this, we're not really talking about necessarily the pro-World Orthodox or the anti-World Orthodox. There's this theory, and maybe you don't agree with it, Father Joseph, but just tell me, that you have basically the Father George Grabe, later Bishop Gregory Grabe, basically ideology. And then you have the anti-Grabe faction. And the view seems to be that Count von Grabe, later who was ordained
Count George Grabe, yep.
He was made deacon and priest in 1944 by Metropolitan Seraphim Lade, that he believed the best way for the Rope War to operate was essentially to kind of recapitulate the old synodal system of the Holy Governing Synod. That is, you have like an inner synod with kind of maybe a priest administrator with the metropolitan who would kind of handle all the decisions. Okay, and then you'd have like an outer synod, all right, which would be all the other bishops. And that's supposed to have been opposed by like St. John Maximovich, who believed that this was not that there were problems in the whole Holy Governing Synod system, in which all the bishops weren't allowed to participate as much as they should, and therefore they should have a more wider participation in it. I had always kind of heard about that, but it's interesting reading letters and things that they have translated from Google Translate, obviously, about this whole discussion. Now, what's also interesting is that there were segments of the Catechism Church as it emerged into the open in the late 1980s and 1990s that that did not like Bishop Gregory Grabe. And you think this is very strange because Bishop Gregory supported what? I mean, he supported ROAC and such, but it tended to be because there were people who claimed he wasn't really a priest. I don't know if you've ever heard this before. They claimed he was this is part of the problem with some of the traditional true orthodoxy is that people end up claiming everybody's a Mason except themselves.
Yeah.
And it's kind of self-defeating. I mean, there are Masonic conspiracy. That actually does happen. And what they claimed was that because Bishop Gregory, when he was made a deacon and priest back in 1944, was ordained by Metropolitan Seraphim Lade, that this was no ordination. And now why do they claim that? They claim that because Metropolitan Seraphim Lade had been so-called consecrated a bishop in the Living Church, all right, back in like 28 or so.
Right.
And that when he left, now he was made the Living Church bishop of the Ukrainian Autocephalous Living Church, which is not the same as the Lipsinski Autocephalists.
Right.
And he began to actually write things against the Soviets because he actually had a conscience, I believe. And so he basically was expelled from the Soviet Union because the Soviets, I believe, had an agreement with Germany that ethnic Germans could leave. Okay. And when he went to meet Metropolitan Anthony Kropotkin, Metropolitan Anthony was like, well, just as long as you repent of renovationism and you sign the documents, we can celebrate. And a lot of people did not like that in the late 80s and 90s when they discovered it, because their view was that any ordinations carried out by the Living Church, because St. Tikhon had put an anathema on it, saying that no one's to accept their ordinations whatsoever. All right?
Yeah.
But Metropolitan Anthony's view was that they never broke communion, as I understand. There was somewhat of a tension between Patriarch St. Tikhon and Metropolitan Anthony about certain things, because they were abroad. And Metropolitan Anthony did not feel he had to necessarily enforce this provision on all cases. So by economy, he accepted, the Metropolitan Bishop Seraphim laid into the Rocor without a reordination or a care to see or anything. But by economy, I was safe, you know what I mean. And so the argument many of the catechumenists had was that because this was supposedly uncanonical, bishops and they also later claimed Bishop Seraphim Laid was never really baptized. That's actually a Matthew White thing that later came in among the Russian Matthew Whites, strangely. That bishop, and therefore he could never have been made a priest, let alone a bishop in the heretic Living Church. Then the claim is that Bishop Gregory Grabe was never made a deacon or priest, and they claim Bishop Gregory was a leader of the Masonic conspiracy in the Rocor and all this other stuff. Anyway, I didn't know there was actually this amount of intricate attacks upon the Rocor. I mean, I knew there were problems. I don't know what you think about all of that, Father Joseph, but I just, in terms of history, we oftentimes have to address the Rocor, even though it's not our church at the moment, So I don't know what you have to say about the
phone. Well, I mean, I'll tell you, it definitely that there were. It's funny because the
original. But I don't believe Bishop Gregory was any of these things they say.
No, I don't either. I just find it very interesting that that there was actually even a debate between this, because the Secretary of the Synod has always been, to some degree, has always had some sort of level of power in the Rocor historically, and but there were so few bishops that, when I'm saying in comparison to, say, like the Church of Russia before the revolution, that all their voices were heard pretty well anyway. So it doesn't seem to me like it seems to me almost like it's a created problem that would exist if there were 200 bishops. But in the case of the Rocor historically, you could usually count, the number of bishops on two sets of hands.
Remember, after World War II ended, the Rocor Synod was in a point where, for example, when they consecrated Bishop Seraphim of Chicago, Seraphim Ivanov, and they consecrated Bishop Nathaniel Lvov, they had many theoretically. Well, first off, the bishops in China had theoretically submitted to the Moscow Patriarchate. That wasn't technically true, but they thought that had happened actually. And Metropolitan Anthony in 1946 was, couldn't really get enough bishops together as he wanted to do a consecration, and he finally was able to convince. Who was the Rocor Bishop of Chicago in 1946? I cannot remember his name. I think it was Hieronymus or something like that of Chicago, to fly over to Geneva, and Metropolitan Anastasi and the Bishop of Chicago then proceeded to consecrate Bishop Nathaniel Lvov. And then the next day, those three made Bishop Seraphim Ivanov. All right?
Right.
Even though they were it's such a bad situation that even a year after the war ended, they're like, there are some Rocor bishops here, there's some there. Some of them like, well, I can't show up. I'm busy here.
Yerenim Chernov,
yes,
Montreal.
Exactly. So I mean, they were in such a situation that they had. It almost seemed like the Synod could literally disintegrate at any moment, and the Soviets were pushing for that to happen by all mechanisms, and they barely averted their own destruction. And I mean, at that time, we know the MP was going through Europe and taking people away from them and all the rest and such. But then again, you had the great apologist Ivan Andreev come out of all of that, especially after the Soviet Union collapsed, and he's able to escape. And he basically is the one who taught apologetics at Jordanville and wrote the textbook. And for whatever little issues I may have with him, he was dealing, to bring this to apologetics, you're dealing with someone who's basically almost operating in the wilderness, if you know what I mean. There weren't many apologists.
Absolutely. And in that sense, the world owes Ivan Andreev a great debt, because his writings are still teaching people now. And the point is that without, and I say the point is a lot, and I apologize to everyone, but without his contribution, it's impossible to imagine what the world is like when there is no apologetics, except to see the world mired in ecumenism because nobody bothers to stand up for what's right or wrong. So for, I mean, he's of historical import as an apologist, and I know I've said many times, that we haven't really seen large scale apologetics since Overbeck, but I think that Andreev, to that end, was in some ways I don't think of him as an apologist because of the fact that he didn't just write; he was forced to live it in the sense that he had to be part of the catacomb church. He had to, he had to get out of Russia, so on and so forth, and then he became a professor and teacher. But I tend to see his life more as martyric than apologetical. But you've definitely pointed on something that I didn't even consider, which is that really the defense of the faith. At times, he was one of the major voices.
He was part of the original group that went to Moscow to protest the policy, the signing of the agreement with the Soviet government by Sergius. And so his apologetics wasn't simply writing articles defending orthodoxy in an abstract way. He was actually defending orthodoxy with his own person. So
yeah, that's I think the goal for everyone ultimately, even if we don't get that chance.
Anyway, my point. I'm sorry, this is dragged on. My point. No. That these attempts to manufacture controversies, or the actual controversies, or however they happened, and within this Orthodox Church and the other ones, that's unfortunately a part of historical reality. You look in early church history, that was always transpiring.
Yeah.
And
Orthodoxy has always been messy.
I mean, for example, you go back in late 4th, early 5th century. I mean, Saint Jerome was a great saint. But St. Jerome did not recognize St. Meletius or St. Cyril of Jerusalem as really saints.
Yeah.
Because he had lived through the Arians. He didn't trust these people. At the time, from his own perspective, I think he had good reason. But in retrospect, we can see the bigger picture. But
I think whatever we can apply with St. Jerome, we can definitely apply with Ivan Andreev in the fact that they're both, they both.
Well, Saint Jerome wrote apologetics for us. He was defending.
He was one of the great
Arian heretics against the Pelagians. He wrote to defend the Orthodox faith against the Luciferians, who, by the way, Luciferians in that sense are not talking about Satanists. Yeah. They're talking about the followers of Luciferus of Cagliari.
He's most famous for the apologetic against Helvidius.
Helvidius, yes, exactly, who claimed that Our Lady was not perpetually a virgin.
Yeah,
he wrote against Jovinian as well. So,
well, my only point in trying to bring that up was simply that I guess the overarching theme is that even though these were men charged to defend the faith by God and did so, ably and adequately, no one's perfect.
Yeah. Okay, that's right. that's true. That's okay. Well, I've gone on. I've ranted long enough, so let's close everything down.
All right. Well, thank you, everybody, for listening. Thank you, Vladika, for being on. And thank you for everyone who made comments, questions. Again, we're going to try to be there for as long as we can, answering your questions, your comments, and, trying to defend the faith. That's what we do here. So with that, Benedicite.